Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our 39th Inspiration Exchange. Our lab, the Schaar Lab, has started this engagement session in the era of COVID with an overall goal of bringing together researchers in machine learning interested in building cutting-edge machine learning and AI technologies to really transform the world for the better in the area of medicine, but more generally in what we call reality-centric AI. Over these many years by now, we are entering our fifth year, we have evolved these inspiration exchange sessions over time to make them more engaging and more interactive, and we will continue to do so. Today, in our 39th session, I also would like to introduce a new host of Inspiration Exchange. As you know, in the last 2 years, my former postdoc, Fergus Imrie, was the host, the very able and charismatic host of Inspiration Exchange, and I'm tremendously thankful to Fergus for doing so. Unfortunately, Fergus has moved on. He is now a senior researcher and lecturer in his own right, leading his own lab. But I'm very fortunate to have a brilliant senior PhD student, Nabil Sidat, who has been, over the years, has become a very strong collaborator of mine also, with whom I've given numerous tutorials and with whom I'm enjoying every day doing research with. And Nabil Sidat has kindly agreed to lead for the coming year before he graduates this Inspiration Exchange. So thank you, Nabil, for sharing these sessions. The floor is yours.
Yeah, hi everyone. So thanks for the very kind introduction, Mihaela. So welcome everyone to Inspiration Exchange for 2024-2025 academic year. Hope everyone had a fantastic summer. This is our 39th Inspiration Exchange that we started back in 2022. And today we'll be talking about concept bottleneck models. So before jumping into it, we just have some small amount of housekeeping. So the first is the Schaar Lab is recruiting for PhD positions at the moment. These are 5 fully funded positions for the next academic year. We'll be posting some of these links in the chat. So if anybody is interested in applying for PhD in the group, we'll be providing this. In addition to the PhD position, the lab will also be hosting an open day on the 31st of October, where you can come meet Professor Schaar virtually, talk to students in the lab to understand what life is like in the lab. I'll also be providing that link in the chat should you wish to sign up for the open day. So before getting into the session, just to advertise some of our upcoming sessions before the end of the year. So on the 4th of November, the next Inspiration Exchange, number 40, will be looking at digital twins. And then in early December, looking at machine learning testing and deployment. So on to today's session. So in part 1, we'll be looking at concept bottleneck models under the very good leadership of Max, and we'll be hearing a lot about his new NeurIPS 2024 paper on this topic. We really encourage you to post questions in the chat and ask Max many questions that you have through his presentation, and please post these in the Inspiration Exchange channel on Slack, and we'll provide that link. So please post as many questions as you'd like there to ask to Max. And before handing over to Max, we then have a panel discussion following that, so a roundtable and Q&A with 2 amazing industry guests. So first, Dr. Hamid Palangi, and then Dr. Eoin McKinney. I'll introduce them more formally when we get to the panel discussion. So please also, if you do have questions for our panelists, please also post those in the chat. But I'll introduce our great panelists much more once we get on to part 2.
Okay, so hello everyone, and thanks Nabil for the introduction. I'm very excited today to be discussing my recent work on theoretical analysis of concept bottleneck models, and in particular the concept set selection, which, as Nabil has said, should be out soon for NeurIPS 2024, and I'm hoping to see some of you who will be there at the poster session. Okay, so the structure of the presentation will be as follows. We will begin by discussing what we mean by a concept, starting with a picture of what concepts are outside of ML, and then going into how we defined it, our proposed definition. Then we will discuss why we might want to introduce concepts into machine learning and whether it makes sense to do so or not. And then before diving into the theoretical analysis, I will present a little bit concept bottleneck models in particular, which are arguably the most successful architecture for concept-based models. We'll look at the theoretical analysis. We'll check if the empirical results agree with the analysis. And before going into the future directions, I will discuss some other works that exist and concepts for the interested people. And finally, I'll be discussing the future directions in this area that excite me the most. So, okay, let's start with what we mean by a concept. So concepts are mental representations of either objects or ideas that capture sparsities or invariances that happen in the huge amount of information that we receive as humans. So by focusing on these on these representations that capture these invariant characteristics, concepts allow us to operate in our day-to-day lives and in the world efficiently. So for instance, in the concept of a dog, the concept of dog should encapsulate a lot of information that summarizes the huge amount of information that we have received about dogs during our whole lives. So such as, I don't know, dogs have 4 legs, they bark, etc. And these invariances are present in nearly all dogs, which help us when we encounter another situation with a dog, either to identify it or to act next to a dog. This concept should allow us to operate. And it's important to highlight that concepts form around ideas and objects that occur with a certain frequency, non-negligible frequency in our lives, and that are relevant for how we interact with the world. So given that, the definition of a concept has been, like, people have tried to provide definitions of concepts for a long time. Even from the times of Aristotle, the definition of concept was around concepts being a set of ideas that corresponds to a given definition, a set of rules. That is, a concept was kind of a Boolean membership class of examples. However, over the years, like, there's been some investigation from the cognition theory people that has revisited this definition, and now it seems like the definition leans more towards a fuzzy membership into classes instead of a 0 to 1 belonging to a class. And also cognition theory emphasizes the relationship between concepts as something that must be tightly related to our experiences and how we operate in the world. So, okay, concepts are mental representations, that seems clear, but they are not only an end by themselves, they are means, and in fact, they are considered to be a fundamental block in all facets of cognition. So more specifically, concepts allow us to draw appropriate inferences about the type of entities that we encounter in our everyday lives, and are necessary for, among other things, categorization, memory, decision-making, and inference. And okay, so this is, I hope, clear, but how do we translate this into a more formal definition, which is what we try to do first in the paper preceding the theoretical analysis. So in previous machine learning concept-based works, the definition of a concept stops at concepts being maps that take your inputs either to the set 0,1 or to the interval 0,1, and thus implicitly define either a characteristic function or a fuzzy membership function. However, I believe that it's crucial in the definition of concepts to consider the usefulness and the usefulness of concepts in order to aid our everyday task inference. And in order to capture this aiding in everyday task inference, we used the concept of a risk function, which captures this by including the distribution of everyday tasks in the expectation and capturing the aiding in the fact that it contains the loss function and also like the model, the human architecture that is optimized. Okay, so although there might be other approaches to characterizing concepts using these constructs, how we framed it is through two different properties. One which is expressiveness, that tries to capture the ability to like the ability of the addition of a new concept into a concept set to capture more nuances about your like the inputs that you process, and allows you to better perform fine tasks. And another property which is inductive bias, that should make our learning more efficient than directly processing the raw input. So now that we know what concepts are, let's discuss whether it is reasonable at all to incorporate them in ML, and also why we might want to do so. So first, let's look at how they might aid efficiency and generalization through incorporating inductive bias. And it would be reasonable to expect that they might help in this regard, because if concepts have been derived as something that is inherently helpful for humans, then ML might also benefit from that, especially since most of ML tasks, and especially supervised ML tasks, can already be solved by humans, and therefore like the human concepts should be useful for those tasks. However, it's not trivial that this will be the case, like that it will be helpful, because as we know, representations are highly dependent on the hypothesis space that we use, its expressivity, and also the implicit regularization that our learning algorithm has. And we shouldn't take it for granted, because actually our output models are usually linear models, which are very restrictive. So I think it's essential to keep in mind that we're making this CBM assumption, and we will discuss it a little bit more in the empirical results and the future work. But it's not only about these. There's also other incentives to incorporate concepts in ML. Each one of those representing one of the two directions in human-machine interaction. So on the one hand, if we integrate human concepts in ML, it provides a window for us to try to interpret what's happening inside the model. So it enhances interpretability. But on the other hand, depending on how we incorporate these concepts in our architecture, it also provides us with a lever to modify or tweak how these models behave. These two by themselves are two lines of work that are very interesting, but we will not be focusing so much on the interpretability and intervenability. So I hope that with the previous discussion, we can agree that it's at least interesting to explore how we can integrate concepts into ML and then see whether they can be useful or not. So before looking into whether it's useful, let's see what is the most common architecture that it's been used for concept-based models. And in particular, this is concept bottleneck models, which by its name kind of describes what it does. So essentially, CBMs introduce a bottleneck, which is a layer between your feature space and your predictions. And this layer aims to capture or to represent the amount of belonging to one of the different concepts. So for instance, the first concept in the bottleneck for the above image would be sclerosis. And here we would have either a 0-1 value that tries to predict whether this image contains sclerosis or not, or either a fuzzy membership, as we said. There is some flexibility to how this can be achieved. So for instance, one can train the full X to Y map and then add an additional loss function that tries to force these concept representations in the middle there might be, you might first train X to C and then C to Y. But that's not very, like, these differences are not very important for our analysis. It is important to note, though, that in earlier works, concepts required manual labeling. So essentially, this restricted very much both the size of the concept set and also like the variety of concept sets that one could consider for a given concept bottleneck model. Fortunately, very recently, well, not very recently, but somewhat recently, the CLIP, which is a multimodal foundational model, allows us to identify the appearance of concepts within an image. And this has made that CBMs have now become much more widely applicable than they used to be. In our analysis, what we do is we compare two different models, which is the baseline or vanilla model, depending on the place that we're in the paper, like in the figure, which results from using a probe on the clip embedding directly, which is a common practice. And then we have the concept bottleneck counterpart, which we get by fixing the set of concepts and, as we know, like predicting from concepts to labels. So let's dive into the insight from our paper. Let's go into theorem 1 in the paper, which we will have to analyze little by little because there's a bunch of notation that we have not presented here. And let's look first into the left-hand side of the equation, where we are computing the risk. In this case, it's the risk of the concept bottleneck model. And the first term on the right-hand side is a coefficient times the risk of the baseline model. So let's start looking at this term here and assume for now that the epsilon term is 0. And we will discuss it just after this one. So we see that our concept bottleneck model risk here to the left can be lower than the baseline risk if the coefficient that multiplies the risk, of course, is less than 1. And indeed, one can show that this coefficient here is smaller than 1. But the interesting part about this coefficient is not only that this is smaller than 1, but also the information that it gives us about the effect of the concept set size, the cardinality, which appears in like here, and how much benefit you get from the risk. And essentially what we can see here is that we prefer smaller concept set sizes to get like the best risk possible, conditioned on the fact that this small concept set does not increase the epsilon. And we will see that it's not so straightforward because there's an interplay here. So let's go into the epsilon term, which captures the misspecification, by which we mean the amount of information that you lose that would be required to solve the task perfectly. So interestingly, if we look at the coefficient of this term, when the n is small, we see that this term here can be essentially disregarded and as the sample size increases, then this starts to become noticeable, and we will see that it starts to dominate the difference in risks. So essentially, this misspecification term, if you have a very small number of concepts, you will probably lose more information that is essential. So this term would try to push you towards bigger concepts. So there's here a balance that we need to find, but it's not directly the cardinal of the concept set. So if we really chose very well a set of concepts, we might have a small epsilon and still a small cardinal for the concept set. So essentially, what this theorem shows is that concept bottleneck models can be more sample efficiency than the baseline counterpart. But more importantly, also it characterizes the properties that we want in a concept set to maximize the inductive power. And now we go into theorem 2, which instead of inspecting the sample efficiency, it aims to analyze the out-of-distribution generalization capabilities of concept bottleneck models. And in particular, what we do here is look at the at how CBMs can mitigate the effect of confounders or spurious features when learning. And in particular, what we see in this theorem is that under some assumptions that are not shown here, but are not critical for understanding it. The concept bottleneck model can remain unbiased by confounders while the baseline is affected by them. And we will verify this in the experimental insights. Because as we saw before and mentioned, all of these analysis is essentially clinging to the CBM assumption, which is in the first theorem, it can be encapsulated in the bar epsilon, because we in principle have no guarantee that this bar epsilon can get small. And then the CBM assumption also plays an important role in the assumptions for theorem 2. So it is critical to check that these insights actually hold on real data. So in the 3 figures above the diagonal, we compared the scaling laws between the CBM accuracy, which is shown in blue, and the baseline accuracy, which is shown in orange. And what we see is that consistently across the different data sets, in the small sample regime, we actually see that the sample efficiency term, which is the first one in theorem 1, dominates, and thus our concept bottleneck model is overperforming our baseline. And as the number of samples increases and we go to larger ends, then the second term, the one with the epsilon, the misspecification term, starts to dominate. And then at this point, it hurts the CBM performance more than we get sample efficiency, and then it's when the baseline starts to overperform our concept bottleneck model. And this holds for all these experiments. In the bottom left figure, we show that that if we correctly choose the concept set, like the choice of the concept set has a great impact on the actual performance of the concept bottleneck model by comparing how we chose the concept set, which is not really relevant. Like it's not the main contribution of the paper. I consider the insights more important. And we get like better performance than the closest work. Okay, so let's now look closer at the scaling laws and how they depend on the concept set size. So this is an experiment on Cypher-10, and I think that this figure is pretty amazing insofar that it really agrees with the insights that we had derived. So we see very clearly that for smaller concept sets, the first term is benefits significantly from it, and the second term, which for small n's can be disregarded, has very little effect. But as we get more and more samples per class, then what we start to see is that here the sample efficiency becomes less relevant, and what starts to dominate is that bigger concept sets can capture more of the relevant information and then end up with a higher performance. So now that we've seen the effect on sample efficiency, we go into more out-of-domain generalization experiments. So again, here the results align pretty well with our insights. And on the left, we have one experiment from the MetaShift data, one of the MetaShift datasets, which allow us to control the distribution shift between training and test distributions. So when we're more to the left in the x-axis, the distribution shift is higher, and when we're more to the right, the distribution shift is smaller. And as we see here, the higher the distribution shift is, the more important is the relative increase of performance that we get from the concept bottleneck model with respect to the baseline. And here, in this plot, we tested 3 different probes instead of the linear probe, which it's done in the rest of the experiments. And we also tested what would happen with a k-nearest neighbors probe and a tree-based node. And we see that, interestingly here, the one that seems to be most beneficial in terms of concept bottleneck model with respect to the baseline is for the tree, which kind of suggests probably it's overreading it, and I wouldn't claim that this is the case, but it might suggest that there's a better alignment of trees with the human architecture than a linear probe. But in any case, we also trained here at the top right the out-of-distribution generalization from Cynic 10 to Cypher, and we also saw that there's better performance from the CBM compared to the vanilla. And then over the 12 of the tasks in out-of-distribution generalization from MetaShift, we also see consistently that the concept bottleneck model is less affected by the spurious features than the vanilla counterpart. Okay, so I hope that these insights from the paper are interesting. But before going into future work and finishing the presentation, I'd like to make a quick overview of other works in concept-based ML outside of CBMs, and in particular outside the ones that only focus also on the predictability. So first, some years before the introduction of CBMs, there were some works that already worked on introducing concepts into machine learning. And in particular, I would point out to this TCAB paper, which aimed to find within some of the hidden layers of a neural network the presence of a pre-specified concept by trying to take a linear classifier between the examples that had this concept and the ones that didn't. And then the paper to the right tries to extend this by making it more flexible and more unsupervised in terms of not having to pre-specify what the identification of a specific concept. So in our work, we don't focus on the bidirectional interaction human concepts, but I wanted to highlight these two works, for instance, and also these two directions as active areas in research. Then regarding concept bottleneck models, there's, as I said, a lot of work that works in interpretability and interpretability. But I wanted to highlight these two works, which would be postdoc concept bottleneck models, which among other contributions that they provide, they consider fitting the residuals of the CBM with a black box model. This has the potential to minimize the misspecification term, which I think is a strength of this approach. Of course, it comes at the cost of other properties, such as the robustness to out-of-distribution generalization or the interpretability, etc. But one can find a balance here, and depending on the situation, I think it's important to know that one can consider these approaches, and this might be especially useful in hybrid scenarios where some human concepts are relevant, but there are some concepts missing that would be required to perform the task well. And on the other hand, in the right, we have one work in particular that has started to try to incorporate some hierarchy of concepts into the CBM. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this is because I haven't mentioned this, but concepts have a natural hierarchy or some relationship between concepts, which is not only association between concepts or similarity. And I wanted to stop here because although clip embeddings are very useful, and one expects that one direction in the embedding space of a clip model corresponds to a specific concept, I have the feeling that this representation must be inherently flawed, because you cannot capture with this geometry here the actual hierarchy in concepts, but only this relationship. But in any case, there's much more work on concept-based models for many different purposes, and this is a recent survey that you can check for other surveys in more specific sub-areas of concept-based approaches and a taxonomy of different approaches. So if you're interested, feel free to scan the QR. And now we'll jump to the future works that are, maybe these ones are a little bit bolder and more distant in the future, but I think that they are exciting. So I hope that this might serve as inspiration for some of you. And the first one that I want to discuss is that since concepts are representation that have appeared, like human concepts have appeared for our highly multimodal and highly multitask interaction with the world, and they have been refined also through generations because we kind of teach it to our children and so on. I feel that these concepts must capture some valuable sparsities that should transfer across different tasks and modalities. So assuming that, then concepts might serve as bridges between different tasks or different domains and help us harmonize different data sets or enhance in some way transfer learning or meta learning. Then another thing that I wanted to mention was that although the focus of this paper is not that, and this is a potentially silly direction, concepts might allow us to investigate a little bit how the human brain works in some sense and its architecture. And that's something that I went a little bit over during the presentation. But if concepts are helpful to humans and the human architecture converts to them, that might give us some clues on what is this human architecture, right? And we can use this information to find out what are the human inductive biases by learning new tasks with our existing concepts and comparing how this is learned by machine learning. And finally, concepts can also be used to inject prior knowledge and inductive biases outside supervised learning, which is where concept-based models are usually used for. And it could be used, for instance, in supervised learning or reinforcement learning to improve both the convergence and the generalization abilities of the result. And I think that's also an exciting direction to explore.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Max, for that. That was really great. And I think it'll serve, especially the last bit of all of the future work, I think it'll serve for a very nice jump into our panel discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two amazing panelists and firstly thank them for taking the time to join us. I think we're all very appreciative for their time. So the first person who is joining us is Dr. Hamid Palangi. So he is a staff research scientist at Google, as well as an associate professor at the University of Washington. And the second panelist is Dr. Eoin McKinney, who has been on Inspiration Exchange before. He has a chair in the Department of Medicine at the University of Cambridge, as well as being a consultant at the Cambridge University's NHS Trust Hospitals, as well as being a faculty member in the Cambridge Center for AI in Medicine. So thank you both for joining us. And I guess to jump into the panel. So I know Max definitely had many questions for both the panelists. So I don't know, Max, if you'd want to start. I think you are on mute, Max.
Yeah, sorry. I start with Hamid, if that's okay. Is it pronounced Hamid or?
Yes, that's correctly pronounced. And thank you for the great presentation, by the way.
Thank you. So I'm interested in knowing your view on the way that you think that we should incorporate inductive biases into models. So I think that I see like in the midterm or longer term, there's different directions that I can see, but I would like to know your input. So for instance, one would be to have directly a generalized foundational model, which learns in context or is fine-tuned for specific tasks, and that should implicitly inherit like the concepts that it has learned for other, like in his pre-training. For instance, there would be some other way where we can use concepts such as CBMs. It's another approach that we can use to incorporate these inductive biases, but I don't know how you see this evolving long term. Like, what is your take on it?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, hello, everyone. This is my first time in this session. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much for inviting me for this discussion. And regarding the question, actually, I have also several questions in this domain because there are several open questions, as you pointed out in your presentation. In terms of how to really try to use inductive biases into the model during the training or post-hoc, there has been several attempts over time. For instance, you touched upon concept bottleneck models, which are very important. And there was a work that we did with Paul Smolensky, who is a linguist at Johns Hopkins. And there, the belief that he had was that in language, grammar and semantics should be decomposed. And there, what we tried was trying to inject this inductive bias into the way that we train a language model. At that time, it was LSTMs, having separate representation embeddings for grammar and then semantics, and then trying to bind them together using these tensor product representations. And there, the angle that we had was also interpretability and to be able to better understand the model. And of course, there are recent works on, sparse autoencoders and all of that. One challenge, though, that I think is ongoing is that when we induce such inductive biases into the model, there is usually a gap between the performance of the model that we build, which is more interpretable, versus the model that is just trained end-to-end. And that is important in some domains, but not important in others. If you are working on a very high-stake decision-making domain, maybe you are okay to have a lower performance on some benchmarks, but making sure you understand why the model is doing what it is doing. But for some other domains, it might not be as tolerable. So that's the take that I have, and I believe working on that gap in the performance can be valuable. That's the high-level view that I have there in very general and vague way. But if you have more specific questions, I'd be happy to jump into more discussion.
Great. I'll follow up first with a question for Eoin. I don't know how to pronounce this, sorry. But I wanted to ask you, so just as Hamid rightly put, so I guess interpretability, both interpretability and interpretability, for instance, would be very helpful, I guess, for clinicians to feel confident in these high-stakes scenarios to use these models, right? My question, though, is, would it be enough? So what is your requirements what are the requirements that you think would be needed for one such model to be used in practice? Because even you have some interpretability, you don't have real guarantees that things are happening the way you want them to happen, right? So what would you require for a model to be used in practice?
So I'm going to try and answer that, and I'm going to follow up with a question of my own, if that's all right. You're absolutely right. Basically, in clinical medicine, concepts are the bread and butter of everything we do. Everyone has a diagnosis. Everyone fits into a beautiful category. And on the face of it, the accuracy is 100% when you get a clinician to do it, because we come down into discrete little categories and everyone likes to have, and everyone gets a label before we can treat them. So you get diagnosed as disease X, Y, or Z. What you learn very quickly after you leave medical school is that's what it's like in the textbook, but not what it's like in the real world. Whereas actually everyone has comorbidities. No one really fits into those neat buckets. And that actually most patients sit in fuzzy concepts, right? They're not really nestled neatly and purely into neat categories. So I think, how accurate would we need a model to be? Well, ostensibly, everything ends up being 100% accurate because we put them into the group that we are most confident about. But no model is ever going to be that accurate. And what I was perhaps most interested about in your presentation is when you were showing the performance, particularly performance when you're training on increasing numbers of examples, your performance and accuracy is increasing, but it varied from data set to data set as to where that plateau was reached. Sometimes you're hitting 60% accuracy and getting no better, sometimes 90, and that will vary a lot by data sets. And one of the fascinating things for me is actually, could you use this, as where my question comes in, could you use this as an approach to explore the concept space and effectively tell me what I don't know? So if I have 3 concepts that I think neatly describe a particular conceptual subspace, let's say 3 diagnoses that I think exist to explain a group of symptoms, it might be that your misspecification errors are telling me more than your accurate classification, and that you might be able to tell me that there are other concepts out there that are unexplored or undiscovered. Do you think that's feasible?
So I think that this misspecification term is more, so this misspecification term goes or can be measured better at the data set level than for an individual level. So if you're trying to say, identify these 3 concepts for this patient, this is different a little bit than how the concept bottleneck model does.
No, sorry. That's me not getting myself across accurate. I don't mean for an individual. I mean for a group of individuals. So you can identify individuals who fit there, but there are individuals who don't fit into any of the neat concepts. So there may, I say I only have, in a simple example, 3 possible diagnoses, and I have someone who doesn't quite fit into any 3. It may well be they have a new entity that we've not discovered.
So this might be done potentially or approached through this hybrid model, where you have like these concepts that you fix and you see how well this performs, and then you try to fit the residuals, right? And you see what is the gap here. Maybe if the gap is big, you might be missing like other information. I think this would be a plausible way to approach this problem, and it's interesting. So, however, I think that one things that worries me a little bit about concept bottleneck models, for instance, it's interesting that they have like a better performance at the low data regime, right? But it seems like in high stakes scenarios, if you have so little data, then you won't trust the model anyway, just because you don't have like the guarantees that come from higher amounts of data, right? And if you have more and more data, then you might be better off with a non-bottlenecked model. So this is one of the things that seems to me a little bit on what Hamid was saying, right? So you sometimes have, well, yeah, at least in the very small data regime, you have these clash between interpretability and performance, and I don't know, like I understand that interpretability is important for clinicians to use a model, right? But is it more important than performance? That's something that I'm not sure what would be the answer here.
Yeah, I mean, they're both important, you're right, and it's hard to trade one off against the other. I think in medicine, it's whilst you can clearly see that accuracy improves with more data, there are frequently scenarios where we have to operate with limited amounts of data, and perhaps that's where concept bottleneck models with their better performance with fewer examples might come in, because we're still required to make a diagnosis even where we have little information. So rare disease being one example. Where you have rare diseases, rare conditions, you're having to categorize someone as having a particular disease with very few examples on which to base that. That's true for new disease, just the same as it's true for rare disease. So I think even superior but still imperfect performance in that region can still be very useful.
Okay. Great. I don't know
my one other thought, sorry if I can just quick one other one. The idea that you can have a conceptual subspace and quantify distance across conceptual subspace is really interesting, right? You know, if you use whatever form of error or misclassification error, whatever it is, to plot in conceptual subspace, because you could start to consider health and disease as concepts as well. and then start to see whether you move an individual over time from one concept towards another. So they may start in the concept of health. They may develop disease and move away from health, and then your treatment could do one of two things. It could either move them back towards health, or it could move them into a new concept, which is treated disease that may indeed not look anything like health. And that becomes itself conceptually interesting for looking at how treatments work, and perhaps in making inferences about their effects as well.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting, definitely. So we would need like something very reliable in that embedding space, right? But if we could approach this, it would be really, really useful. Yeah.
And then I guess I had a little follow-up question for Hamid. So I guess it's like piggybacks a bit of what Owen was talking about, where some of this here you might want to do it like automatically discover the concepts. I was curious, Hamid, in terms of your opinion, I guess, so Max has shown a bit where like CLIP is being used in his framework. Do you think advances like, I guess, foundation models, so either language models or vision language models, could serve some degree of a role in terms of how do you even get these concept sets in the first place?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And by the way, I totally resonate with what Eoin mentioned in terms of being able to diagnose and being able to come up with accurate concepts. That's actually quite challenging problem. In terms of your question, Nabil, one challenge that we have had for years, actually, when it comes to interpretability, is that we do not have quite clear ways to evaluate how good interpretability method A is versus interpretability method B. And if you think about it, for instance, think about LIME or SHAP. These are very well known out of the box, interpretability method that people use to attribute a classifier decision or any model decision to specific parts of the input, for example. It's not at the level of concepts, which is more in the hidden representation level of the model. Even for those, we use them. However, we do not have quite clear ways of comparing them together or evaluating them, because we are not tying them to a specific utility. And to automatically tie these interpretations for any given interpretability method to a utility that makes sense is usually challenging. There are several works on that. For instance, we tried to use one of them with GPT-2 and TUnit and all of that. But then model sometimes comes up with ways to utilize information that is not even interpretable to humans. And that makes it quite challenging in the sense that there was actually this work last year actually showing that the best prompts are not necessarily the most human-readable prompts. Sometimes the models might leverage more from the representations that are not as interpretable from the way that we define interpretability. So there are those open questions which are actually not completely answered from what I've learned so far in the literature. But in terms of the domain that we focus on, I think that plays an important role. For instance, Max mentioned that for using CLIP model, he can automatically extract these concepts, and that makes it easier to not re-annotate or use annotated data. I think these are valuable. These are quite valuable. But still, there is a proxy there in the sense that there is a model that is CLIP. How great it is. It's a wonderful model, but that will be our oracle. That would be the best that we can do there. My perspective is that whatever concept that we extract and the set of concepts that we use, or the way of attribution that we have, we need to tie it to a downstream utility that we really care about. In the case that Eoin was mentioned is diagnosis, how to have accurate diagnosis. So we need to do human studies. We need to make sure that those are actually grounded to what we have seen historically. For other domains, what are the utilities that we care about? For instance, in the domains that we care about in industry, there are several. For instance, in summarization, we want to have good summaries. In question answering, we want to have good models to answer questions accurately. In retrieval, we want to have a good ranker. In retrieval augmented generation, we want to have accurate responses given the information from ranker and an autoregressive model like Gemini. Would attribution contribute to improving performance on those downstream utilities? That's actually the most difficult question these days for us.
I'd be quite curious to know. So you mentioned human studies. So do you think human studies, at least, are the only way to do the evaluation, or do you see some room for automated evaluation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, these systems are built for humans. So there is, at the end, we need to, if we really want to evaluate them, we need to really go as extensive as we can in terms of seeing how useful they are for the users of the systems, depending on the domain that we care about. But in terms of automation, I believe having these large foundation models have been a breakthrough, which has made it possible to have less, with the less investment on human studies and simulating it on these models, but then still doing the human studies to make sure there is enough agreement between what these models are generating versus humans. There are ways to reduce the costs for human studies. But then at the end, I believe all this system should be human-centered in the sense that they should be useful for their users, that they are using them. If we come up with a great method to do great work in interpretability, are the users happy with those concepts and interpretations that it is providing? How to measure that? How to go about that? I think those studies are sort of an inseparable part when we really want to have them productionized.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And I think definitely the cost aspect is definitely super important. I guess like Owen can probably attest to, it's really hard to get many clinicians to do a large scale human studies.
Yes.
I'd actually be curious, Owen, to follow up on that one before we go to our audience Q&A. If a human study were to be done to assess something like a system like Max proposed, would it just be about the clinician finding it useful, or would it also need to like fit in well to a clinical workflow and not disrupt the clinical workflow too much beyond just like helping a decision?
Well, disruption's fine as long as that disruption's positive, right? It would certainly have to assimilate and work within a clinical workflow. The big question is, it always boils down to the same thing in a clinical study: is what information are you adding beyond what we've already got, and what is the actionable information? So what can I do with the information you're giving me? From a diagnostic perspective, that can be helpful. I think fuzzy concepts are probably the right way to go there, because we know that individuals and patients are fuzzy, and that also brings in the idea of uncertainty around the fitting. But no, I don't think I think clinicians would be open to this. I think the idea of concepts is such a familiar one that conceptually it should work. It would always be expensive and long for any human study, is the problem.
No, awesome. Thank you so much, both Owen and Hamid. I believe just before we end, we do have a question in the chat from Max. Daniel, if you'd like to unmute yourself to ask the question.
Yes, sure. So first of all, thanks for your presentation. It was very nice. I was just trying to understand the concept of a concept. So what you have is you start with a certain set of covariates, and you want to predict the outcome. That's the general setting. So from what I understand, a concept is just another specification onto these covariates with some guaranteed properties with respect to the risk. Is that correct?
So you mean by the definition, right?
Yeah, by the definition.
So yes, so a concept in the definition would be and the addition of a new concept, like a concept set, depends on the order in that definition of how you build your concept set, because you will not develop a concept that is too overlapping with concepts that you already had from the definition. And the concept will be incorporated if it's useful enough for a set of tasks, where useful depends on how you use it, right? In the setting of concept like models, it would be if I add this concept as an additional neuron in this bottleneck, will I get a better performance? And the performance comes in these two different measures, which is the expressiveness, which would be how better it helps me capture more nuanced parts, or it would help me more towards the decreasing the misspecification. And then there's the inductive bias, which is essentially how much is it better like that than just making this directly from the input, right? Why do I need to develop a concept for that, which would help in the more like lower data domain? So that would be like the rationale behind it.
So just to follow up, if I'm allowed, so adding extra covariates to your model to see if it improves the model versus adding a concept. From what I can understand, a concept is dependent on the covariates in the data.
Yeah.
Is that the main difference as well?
So one problem, like if you just were to increase the number of covariates, so in the low data regime, for instance, according to theorem 1, what we would see is that since you're increasing the dimensionality, you could see like essentially like each feature, you could consider it as a essentially like a concept as an additional feature, then this increase of dimensionality will be hurtful to performance. So it's not necessarily the same of increasing the number of features. And also there's like, so there would be some correlation between features and concepts, which might, depending on the model, also hurt your generalization and what you learn. But I mean, you could incorporate concepts as additional features, but it's not necessary. Like the definition of concepts here, if you wanted to add them as additional features, you could, I guess, but I don't know. It defeats a little bit the purpose of concepts as these high-level representations, probably.
Well, in general, so what's nice about concept is this definition where you already have some sort of guarantees with respect to the risk once you add them to your model. This you do not have with adding covariates. So in that sense, concepts are sort of less risky than adding covariates because you already have an underlying property that you define with the definition.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answers.
Awesome, and thank you so much, everyone. I really want to thank again both Hamid and Eoin for really taking the time. I think the panel discussion was super engaging, and I think I really just want to thank them again so much for joining us today. Just before ending, to highlight that today's session will be on YouTube fairly soon. And our next session, Inspiration Exchange 40, will be on digital twins on the 4th of November. And to stay up to date, have a look on the lab website, let people know if you found today's sessions interesting. And we really wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially Hamid and Eoin for making the time.